In February 2023, the LDS Church announced a new round of temple ordinance changes. There was a lot of excitement surrounding this, which is to be expected, certainly. I did, however, communicate with several people and asked them why it needed to change and was it wrong before the change. Almost without fail, they said it didn't change but was updated or improved. Certainly, everyone mentioned something to that effect. The question, though, is why? Why did it need to change? Was it wrong before? Is it right now? Does everyone need to do it again? Did God want it changed? What are the words of God requesting the change? And why did it need to change just 4 years after the last set of changes? I think it is safe to say that God works with imperfect people, and we certainly can't comprehend all that God is or has to offer all at once. Therefore, some degree of change is certainly understood. However, the larger the changes, the more we should question them. God may tweak this or that based on current circumstances. However, if one day it is one way and the next day it is significantly different, then we really should stop and think about that for a moment. If we are off in even one detail, then it is not God's ordinance, and he might not accept it. This is also further complicated because according to Joseph Smith, the ordinances were all revealed to man, and they were final and should not change. If they are final and should not change, then why are they being changed? Joseph Smith said, God set the ordinances to be the same forever and ever, and set Adam to watch over them, to reveal them from heaven to man, or to send angels to reveal them. If they were given to us and are supposed to be the same forever and ever, then why are we changing them? Joseph Smith also said, ordinances instituted in the heavens before the foundation of the world in the priesthood for the salvation of men are not to be altered or changed. All men must be saved on the same principles. If we are changing things without the permission of God, then we are not doing God's work. That is very important to understand. Based on these two statements alone, we should be incredibly cautious about changing anything regarding the temple ordinances or anything associated with them. However, it seems that is not quite the case. The following is a list of all the changes the LDS Church has done to their ordinances or related garment as far as I can find records for. In 1855, in May, the endowment house opened for living ordinances. However, very little is known about the temple ordinances at this point. From available records, they appeared to be very similar to the Old Testament records. The initiatory washings were done in actual large basins of water. The anointing portion of the washing was performed using liberal amounts of consecrated oil that was poured over the entire body. The garments at this time were one-piece full-body articles that the person would take home and sew the marks in themselves. Any alterations to the garments past this point were not appropriate. At this time, only living ordinances were allowed, and a person can only go through the temple a single time. 1856, baptisms for the dead begin again after the pause for not completing the Nauvoo temple in time. 1867, January, the second anointings were performed for top leadership for the first time since the Nauvoo era. 1876, proxy endowments are permitted. 1877, members can now go through the temple more than once, however in a limited fashion. In January, the temple endowment script was written for the first time through a committee of leaders. This took approximately 2 months for them to agree on the language. This would suggest that prior to this point, then every time someone performed the ordinance, there was some difference. In February, temple officiators began the practice of wearing white clothing. However, President Brigham Young mentioned that normal clothing should be the attire used. 1884, President John Taylor mentioned that a member woman who married outside of the church should not wear garments and should not participate in the temple. 1887, in June, President Woodruff was speaking about the ordinances and was quite adamant that we should, quote, follow the pattern that President Young has set us and not deviate from it one iota, end quote. And that if we did deviate even to a single degree, then, quote, God would not approve it, end quote. 1894, the shirt portion of the garment was deemed to not be part of the temple clothing and was no longer marked. 1905, President Joseph F. Smith declared that sealings for the dead can only be performed for those who were legally married in life. In addition, all ordinances for the dead are denied for anyone who committed murder, committed suicide, or were excommunicated from the church. Exceptions were allowed, however, they needed to be decided by the temple president. Between 1904 and 1907, there was a Reed Smoot hearing, congressional hearing. Reed Smoot, an apostle, testified during the congressional hearing that, quote, the endowments have never changed and can never change as I understand it. It has been so testified, and that Joseph Smith Jr. himself was the founder of the endowments, end quote. 1912, President Joseph F. Smith was growing dissatisfied with the members' dislike for the full-body garment. Women were complaining that it was making it difficult to wear modern fashions and asked if the garment could be altered to accommodate the more revealing clothing. He responded, quote, the saints should know that the pattern of endowment garments was revealed from heaven, and that the blessings promised in connection with wearing them will not be realized if any unauthorized change is made in their form or in the manner of wearing them, end quote. 1915, in March, the First Presidency wrote a letter stating, the pattern of the temple garment was given by revelation to the prophet Joseph Smith. 1916, the First Presidency issued a letter saying that in member marriages, the husband is to be endowed before the wife. If a woman is to marry a non-member, then she should be prohibited from receiving her endowments. 1922. In August, the endowment ceremony underwent significant changes involving the altering of clothing and the wording used. The changes were made to remove some aspects of the ceremony that were deemed redundant. In September, several changes were adopted, which mostly were wording changes. At this time, the prayer circle and the veil portions were scripted. 1923. In April, the First Presidency authorized modifications to the garment. This is just a few years after the death of Joseph F. Smith, who was adamant that the garment should never be modified because it was given directly by God. The modifications included the removal of the collar, tie strings are replaced with buttons, and the open crotch of the garment was enclosed. The woman's garment is shortened to the elbows and knees. In June, the First Presidency released a statement describing the old garment style as, quote, coarse, unbleached, and irritating, end quote. In this letter, they described the allowed changes, however made it optional. Official temple instructions were added that stated any unauthorized changes to the garment turn the garment into, quote, only a piece of underwear, which is not a garment, end quote. 1924. In June, the St. George Temple president, David H. Cannon, rejected the temple ordinance changes using statements from Brigham Young and Joseph Smith that indicated changes should not be performed. He stated Brigham Young and Joseph Smith flushed out the ordinances and we should use them as they were given. He was told that the first presidency and 12 apostles were at the head of the church and were responsible for the changes. He was then instructed, according to the St. George Temple presidency meeting minutes, to, quote, gather up all the old rulings and instructions and burn them, end quote. This was, of course, to eliminate the confusion between the new way of doing things and the old way. 1927. A first presidency letter was issued that removed a kiss that took place during a proxy sealing ordinance. The scripted wording for the prayer circle was changed to remove the oath to avenge the blood of the prophets and seek retribution for the saints' wrongs. 1930. The men's garment is modified to more closely match the woman's. The garment is shortened to the knees and elbows. However, the full-length garment is still required in the temple. 1934. Women who marry outside of the church are allowed to receive their endowments if their non-member husband gives them permission. During the same year, the church released an official publication written by Elder John A. Widsoe, which stated, quote, there have been no changes in the garment, end quote, and that the recent changes were, quote, just a minor thing in line with our needs, end quote. As part of this change, the covenant of chastity was also altered so that the wording reflected an endowed woman can live with an unendowed husband and not be breaking the covenant. 1936. The first presidency decided to allow sleeveless garments for women. This is to allow them to wear modern styles of clothing without any part of the garment showing. 1937. The first presidency declares that baptisms for the living are no longer authorized in any temple. 1938. The first presidency issues a letter stating that strap garments are not allowable. This would, of course, indicate that some women were modifying the garment and adding shoulder straps, or altering the garment to have shoulder straps, which I think they defined as a narrow strip of fabric. 1940. The ring ceremony is removed from the sealing ordinance itself. Rooms and temples that allowed private prayers were repurposed to prevent those individual prayers. They didn't want people praying in the temple for some reason. 1955. The endowment was first filmed and included a small portion of the Disney movie Fantasia. In November, the First Presidency issued a statement further clarifying what is allowed in garments and what was not allowed. This statement reiterated previous policies, however, allowed shoulder strap sleeveless style garments. In December, the First Presidency sent a letter requesting more male members to perform proxy ordinances, as the women were far outpacing the men. The letter instructs temple presidents that they can pay 90 cents per endowment session. Today, that would be about $10. 1957. In March, the First Presidency sends a letter that allows counselors in the stake presidency to interview members for a temple recommend. However, this letter specifically disallows bishopric counselors to do the same. 1959. The First Presidency authorized the shortening of ordinances because there was a worry among the leadership that, quote, that if the church kept on growing the way it was, then every adult member of the church could spend 8 hours a day in the temple, 7 days a week, all of his life, and we would never come up to the rate of new births in the world. End quote. 1961. The temples began to run out of names to perform proxy ordinances. This was at a time when genealogical research was incredibly time-consuming and labor-intensive. In response, the First Presidency allowed the ordinances to be performed out of order and based on what was previously declared to be incomplete records. Prior to this, all ordinances had to be performed in the same order as the living would receive them. 1962. The Salt Lake Temple is reduced to 5 endowment sessions per weekday, while women are only allowed a single endowment session per day. Women at that time were making up bulk of the sessions, and they continue to do so. So the church wanted to rein that in. 1965. In January, all temples were standardized so that the new name received was consistent. This was also to allow a person to look up a new name from their ordinance records and the time that they received it. In May, the embrace at the veil was removed, as some female members found it to be offensive and humiliating. In May, the First Presidency also authorized the garment used in the temple to more closely match the one used outside of the temple. Prior to this, the members were still using the original style with the collar, tie strings, and open crotch. 1966. In July, the First Presidency issued a letter stating that civilly married members should normally wait for 1 year to be sealed. However, this can be waived if the parents are not members to make it more convenient for non-member parents. In August, the decision to exclude those who have committed murder, suicide, or were excommunicated was reversed. All names are authorized for all proxy ordinances, quote, except those of known Negro blood, end quote. It was clarified, however, that anyone who works at a casino was not to have administrative or leadership callings and cannot hold a temple recommend. 1969. The ordinances were shortened again to remove repetition and to make them more streamlined. 1975. The old-style ceremonial garment was removed from all ordinances. 1978. In May, the First Presidency discontinued the practice of private prayer circles in chapels and temples. Prior to this, individual members could be the voice of the prayer. However, this was changed to only allow temple workers to be the voice. In June, all races were allowed full access to the temple ordinances. In December, the First Presidency authorized a 2-piece garment with separate top and bottom pieces, in addition to the standard 1-piece that was used at the time. 1981. The First Presidency authorized the use of a crew neck top for men serving in the military. 1982. In January, the First Presidency sent out a letter stating that married couples engaged in, quote, unnatural, impure, or unholy practices, end quote, such as oral sex, should not be given a temple recommend. In October, the First Presidency clarified that leaders should no longer ask married couples about their marital relations, and leaders should now stick to the specific recommended questions. This was, of course, after intense backlash that they received. 1985. The First Presidency updated instructions to indicate members were allowed to briefly remain and pray in the celestial room after an endowment session. 1987. The First Presidency authorized a survey of members to ascertain their thoughts concerning the endowment ceremony. 1989, the First Presidency issued clarifications that names of all persons involved in the ordinance no longer needed to be recorded. Prior to this, the names of proxies, witnesses, and officiator were recorded with every proxy ordinance. This significantly reduced the administrative burden of the temple record keeping. They were basically keeping every detail, and then they stopped doing that, so just a huge time saver. 1990. In response to the 1984 survey results, the First Presidency authorized significant changes to the ordinances. This included removing several aspects of the endowment, such as all the penalties, sworn oaths, and the covenant for women to obey their husbands, and physical contact, which was referred to as the 5 points of fellowship. Additionally, key aspects of Lucifer's role, along with Adam's, were removed. The film used during the endowment ceremony was updated as well. 2005. The First Presidency authorized the changing of the washing and anointing portion to no longer involve touching individual body parts. The person is instructed to wear the garment prior to entering the washing room. Prior to this, they were nude and wore a two-sided shield, which personally was slightly awkward at times. 2008. Members are no longer required to stand during the endowment. 2013. The First Presidency authorized a new, higher quality film to be used during the endowment ceremony with the same wording as the previous film. 2019. In January, the First Presidency authorized changes in the endowment ceremony. These changes included changing women's associations and covenants to their husbands, expanding the role of Eve, and treating men and women very similarly. The movie used in the endowment ceremony was also significantly changed to be composed of still images instead of a live action film. In October, the First Presidency authorized the changing of the temple recommend questions. The new wording clarified some questions and softened the church's stance on other questions. 2020. In January, the First Presidency sent a letter announcing simplification changes in the clothing worn while performing the endowments. This is the ceremonial clothing. This was to make the clothing easier to use and care for, according to the LDS newsroom statement. In May, the First Presidency discontinued the practice of requiring most couples who marry civilly to wait 1 year prior to their sealing ceremony. In July, the First Presidency authorized changes in all ordinances to remove most of the physical contact in order to comply with health regulations. 2023. In February, the endowment ceremony was updated to inform the participants what was going to happen and give them an ability to more accurately consent to it. Prior to this point, a question was asked to allow the members to opt out, but they had virtually no idea of what was going to happen. In addition, the witness couple is removed and the officiator's role is lessened, giving the presentation itself more prominence. The presentation was also updated to include more depictions of Christ, along with the depiction of the war in heaven. Lastly, all physical contact along with movement is removed until the very end when the person passes through the veil. In short, anyone who has claimed that the LDS temple ceremonies or the garment have not changed is simply not being honest. Things have changed, and they have changed quite a lot in some instances. Many will argue whether the ordinances are of God, which is fine. However, we really should be asking why the need to change at all. Where is the Word of God requesting the change? Why are we allowing the leaders to make these changes that always seem to conform to modern political desires or whims of fashion?